Shaq watched the TV screen as Senator Calloway, once untouchable, was dragged away in cuffs. But something was wrong. Calloway wasn't furious. He wasn't even resisting. He looked terrified. Then Shaq's phone buzzed, an encrypted email. He opened it and froze. The files inside weren't just about Calloway. They exposed something much bigger. Someone else was pulling the strings, and Shaq had just stepped into their game. Who was really behind it all? And how far would they go to stop him? All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq flipped the gold-trimmed invitation between his fingers, eyes narrowing as he read the name printed in bold lettering. The Calloway Foundation cordially invites you to an evening of charity and change, a charity gala for underprivileged kids, hosted by Senator Richard Calloway, a man whose record was too perfect to be real. Shaq had seen this play before. The staged generosity, the extravagant events, the politicians shaking hands while their pockets got fatter. Calloway had built an image of a selfless public servant, but Shaq didn't trust men whose reputations were spotless. It meant the dirt was just buried deeper. His phone buzzed. A text from his business manager. "You're confirmed for the gala. Black tie? Play nice." Shaq exhaled sharply. If there was something off about this event, he'd find out soon enough. The Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom was a temple of wealth. Aged crystal chandeliers bathed the space in golden light, their glow reflecting off silk-covered tables and champagne-filled glasses. The guest list? The country's elite. Billionaires, CEOs, lobbyists, and politicians stood in small circles, their laughter calculated, their smiles sharp. Deals were being made over glasses of aged whiskey. Some of these men controlled the stock market. Others controlled who got arrested and who walked free. Shaq had played with power before, but this wasn't a charity event. This was a battlefield. As he moved through the crowd, offering nods to familiar faces, he listened. Not one conversation was about helping kids. Instead, he caught murmurs about campaign funds, private investments, and offshore accounts. His suspicion grew. Then near the bar, something made him stop. A voice. Low. Urgent. "We're talking millions. It's already gone." Shaq didn't react, but his senses sharpened. His gaze flicked toward two men standing slightly apart from the main crowd. One of them was Calloway's campaign manager, a slick-looking guy in a navy suit, cool and composed. The other? A man who looked nervous, his grip tight around his drink. "Are you sure it's handled?" the nervous man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The campaign manager exhaled, clearly irritated. "Handled? If anyone finds out where the money really went, we're done." Shaq felt his pulse slow. This wasn't just a gala. This was a cover-up. He turned toward the bar, pretending to check his phone, but he was already memorizing their faces. One of these men knew the truth, and Shaq was going to find out who. Shaq wasn't the type to get involved in shady business, but when millions of dollars meant for underprivileged kids suddenly disappeared, it wasn't just shady. It was criminal. The conversation he had overheard near the bar refused to leave his mind. Two men, one of them Calloway's campaign manager, whispering about missing funds. Their body language was tight, tense. They weren't talking about charity. Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't here to play detective, but something was off about this whole setup, and when something felt off, it usually was. Shaq moved through the ballroom like he would on the court, reading the players, watching for weaknesses. The guests at this gala weren't just rich, they were powerful. In one corner, a real estate tycoon with a history of bribing city officials laughed over a drink. Near the dance floor, two senators huddled close, whispering like they were making a deal. The CEO of a billion-dollar investment firm adjusted his cufflinks, while a hedge fund manager grinned at something only they understood. This wasn't a charity event. This was a boardroom without walls. Shaq had been around enough billionaires to know when money was moving in the wrong direction. Near the back of the room, he spotted a silver-haired donor with a whiskey glass in his hand, laughing with a few other men. His face was vaguely familiar, one of those guys who had been in Forbes too many times to count. Shaq approached casually, picking up a drink from a passing waiter. He gestured toward the banners hanging around the ballroom. The Calloway Foundation, building a better future for children. "Big night for the kids, huh?" Shaq said, keeping his voice light. The donor chuckled into his drink. "You actually believe that?" he said, amusement flickering in his eyes. Shaq's expression didn't change. "Should I not?" The man smirked, taking another sip. "You think this is about kids?" He shook his head, looking at Shaq like he was naive. "Wake up." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Then what's it about?" The man sighed, lowering his voice slightly. access, influence. You don't donate to this charity because you care. You donate to get in the room. Shaq's stomach tightened. Before Shaq could ask another question, he felt it. That unmistakable shift in the air. Someone was watching him. His instincts, the same ones that let him see a defender moving before they even stepped, screamed at him. Slowly, he turned his head. Across the ballroom near the grand staircase stood Senator Richard Calloway. The man's expression was unreadable, but his message was crystal clear. He knew Shaq was listening, and he wanted him to stop. Calloway raised his glass, a silent warning. The numbers were too perfect, and that was the problem. Shaq sat in his home office, the glow from his laptop screen illuminating the tension in his furrowed brow. The Calloway Foundation's financial records were up on his screen, looking as pristine as a freshly polished championship trophy. Too clean, too precise. Real charities weren't this neat. There were always minor discrepancies, operational hiccups, unplanned costs. But here, every dollar was accounted for. Every expense was perfectly justified. It looked like an accountant's dream. But Shaq knew better. Shaq wasn't a financial expert, but years of handling multi-million-dollar contracts, sponsorship deals, and investments had taught him how to spot a con. He pulled up donation records and started digging. The foundation claimed to have raised over $50 million in the past 3 years for children's education programs, except when he searched for real projects funded by those millions. He found nothing. No official construction permits for schools, no registered programs under the foundation's name, no documented partnerships with youth organizations. It was all just numbers. A chill ran down Shaq's spine. This money wasn't going where it was supposed to. Someone was moving it, somewhere else, and Shaq needed someone who could help him prove it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Maya Carter. She wasn't just an investigative journalist. She was the journalist, the kind that made corrupt men lose sleep at night. After 2 rings, she answered. Shaq! Her voice was sharp, alert. Didn't expect to hear from you. Shaq exhaled. I need a favor. There was a pause. Then, this sounds serious. It is. He clicked through files, scanning rows of too perfect numbers. I think a U.S. senator is running a charity scam. Silence. Then Maya said, I'm listening. Within hours, Maya was in. She pulled government records, cross-checked tax filings, and ran donation logs through her sources. The first red flag. The donors. Some of the biggest contributors to the Calloway Foundation were shell corporations, businesses that didn't really exist. The second red flag? The spending. Millions of dollars were marked as used for programs, but when Maya dug deeper, there were no receipts, no invoices, no actual spending. Shaq, she said, her voice lower now. This isn't just fraud. Shaq clenched his jaw. Then what is it? Maya took a slow breath. This is money laundering. Shaq felt the weight of those words settle over him. Laundering money through fake charities was an old trick. Corrupt businessmen and politicians had used it for years. But a sitting U.S. senator? That was next level. And it meant this went way deeper than Shaq had thought. Shaq rubbed a hand over his face. He had been hoping this was just a case of mismanaged funds, some greedy politician pocketing donation money. But this was criminal. He leaned back, taking a deep breath. Maya spoke first. We could walk away. This isn't just another scandal, Shaq. If you go after Calloway, he'll come after you. Shaq exhaled sharply. He wasn't scared, but he wasn't stupid either. Calloway had power, connections, and now, a reason to make sure Shaq stayed silent. But Shaq wasn't built to stay silent. His fingers hovered over his keyboard for a moment before he cracked his knuckles. Then let's blow it wide open. Maya's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the documents. Her eyes darted across bank statements, donor lists, and offshore accounts. Shaq, she whispered, voice unsteady. These fake donors? Some of them are dead. Shaq frowned. What? Maya turned her laptop screen toward him. Shaq leaned in, his stomach twisting as he read through the names. A dozen so-called donors. Some had died years ago. Others, they didn't even exist. They didn't. The Calloway Foundation's records were full of ghosts. Shaq exhaled sharply. This isn't sloppy accounting. This is fraud on a whole different level. Maya nodded. And that's not even the worst part. She clicked another file. A new set of transactions appeared. These donations? She said, tapping the screen. They don't stay with the foundation. They're being moved. Shaq's jaw clenched. Where? Maya hesitated before answering. Straight into Calloway's re-election campaign. Silence. Then Shaq let out a bitter laugh. So this whole charity was never about the kids. Maya shook her head. It's a front, a massive laundering operation. Calloway takes illegal money, washes it through fake donors, then cycles it back into his campaign, tax-free. Shaq leaned back, running a hand down his face. This wasn't just corruption. This was organized crime. Maya bit her lip. There's something else. Shaq looked up. What now? She pulled up an old article from a small investigative website. The headline sent a chill down Shaq's spine. Local journalist missing after investigating political corruption. His gut tightened. This guy was onto Calloway. Maya nodded. 3 years ago, he started digging into where Calloway's campaign money was really coming from. He published one story. She exhaled. Then he vanished. Shaq's fists clenched. You're saying Calloway... I'm saying Calloway has power, Maya cut in. And when people get too close, they disappear. Shaq stared at the screen. The journalist's face was frozen in time, a smiling headshot from before he went missing. So if we go public with this, Shaq said slowly, we could be next? Maya swallowed hard. Yeah. Shaq looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he cracked his knuckles. Good, he muttered. Means we're on the right track. Maya sighed. Shaq, I know you want to do the right thing, but this isn't some post-game interview. If we get this wrong, they'll crush us before the truth gets out. Shaq folded his arms. And if we do nothing? That money keeps flowing. Calloway stays in power. More kids get screwed over. That's sit right with you. Maya looked down. Shaq leaned in. You called me for a reason, Maya. You knew I wouldn't walk away. She hesitated. Then she took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, she said. Then we go all in, but we do it smart. Shaq smirked. That's the only way I play. Before Maya could respond, Shaq's phone vibrated. Unknown number. She frowned. You expecting a call? Shaq shook his head and answered. Hello? Silence. Then, a voice. Smooth. Cold. Dangerous. Shaquille. The voice said. I hear you've been asking the wrong questions. Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. Shaq didn't flinch. The voice on the other end of the line was smooth, measured. The kind of voice that belonged to men who never heard the word no. Shaquille, Senator Richard Calloway said, as if they were old friends. I hear you've been asking the wrong questions. Shaq exhaled slowly, gripping his phone a little tighter. So it was official. Calloway knew. That right? Shaq said, his tone calm but edged with steel. Then maybe you should start giving the right answers. A low chuckle. Clever. But trust me, big guy, this isn't your fight. Shaq's jaw clenched. It is now. Calloway sighed, like a parent dealing with a stubborn child. Look, I get it. You want to be the hero. You see something that doesn't sit right and you think you can fix it. Shaq didn't respond. But here's the thing, Calloway continued, his voice dipping lower. Some things are better left alone. Shaq let the silence hang between them. He wanted Calloway to keep talking. The more a man like him talked, the more he revealed. Calloway obliged. This is bigger than some missing money. It's bigger than me, bigger than you. You step out of bounds here, Shaq, and you won't like what happens next. Shaq leaned forward, his free hand gripping the edge of the table. You done? He asked. A pause. Then Calloway sighed again, this time almost disappointed. You really don't get it, do you? Shaq smirked. No, I get it just fine. You're scared. That got a reaction. A flicker of irritation in Calloway's tone. Careful, son. You're making enemies you can't afford. Shaq didn't blink. Funny. I was about to tell you the same thing. A beat of silence. Then Calloway chuckled, low and humorless. All right, he said. Have it your way. Click. The line went dead. Shaq sat there for a moment, phone still in hand. He knew exactly what had just happened. That wasn't a warning. That was a test. Calloway wanted to see if Shaq would back off. He wouldn't. But that also meant Calloway wasn't done. Shaq glanced at his laptop screen. The files were still open. Proof of laundered money, fake donors, offshore accounts. Calloway's entire scheme laid bare. He wasn't just going to let that slide. A slow chill crept up Shaq's spine. Something was coming. And it didn't take long. Later that night, Shaq was in his living room, absently scrolling through his phone when he saw it. A pair of headlights cutting through the dark. He glanced out the window. A black SUV was parked across the street. Engine running. Tinted windows. Not moving. Shaq's fingers curled into a fist. This was a message. Calloway wasn't just threatening him over the phone anymore. He wanted Shaq to know he was being watched. Shaq took a deep breath, exhaling through his nose. He wasn't the kind of man who rattled easy. Slowly he stood, rolling his shoulders back. And then, he walked straight to the front door. The cold night air hit his skin as he stepped onto his porch. The SUV didn't move. The engine hummed softly. A predator waiting. But no one got out. Shaq narrowed his eyes. He He stood there, arms crossed, staring down the vehicle like it was an opponent in the final seconds of a game, waiting, daring them to make the first move. Maya's fingers froze over her laptop keyboard. Then in an instant, her screen flickered. The open documents, Calloway's financial records, offshore transfers, the proof of his entire operation, vanished. A single notification popped up. Error. File not found. Her pulse spiked. Shaq, she whispered, eyes wide. My files just disappeared. Shaq, who had been reviewing notes on his phone, looked up sharply. What do you mean, disappeared? Maya's hands trembled as she clicked through her folders. Gone. Everything was gone. Shaq strode over, looking over her shoulder as she frantically tried to recover the files. Did you delete them by accident? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Maya shook her head. Someone's in my system. She pulled up her security software. Red warnings flashed across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. Files removed. 32. Remote user active. Her breath caught in her throat. Shaq, we're being hacked. Shaq's jaw tightened. He didn't know much about cyber attacks, but he knew one thing. This wasn't random. Calloway wasn't just threatening them anymore. He was erasing the evidence. Shaq grabbed his phone, opening his banking app. His balance stared back at him. $0. A red notification flashed on the screen. Account flagged for suspicious activity. Shaq's pulse pounded. He clicked on transaction history. No withdrawals, no transfers, just frozen. His personal accounts, his business accounts, everything. Maya was still trying to salvage her files when she noticed his expression. What? She asked. Shaq turned his screen toward her. They just locked me out of my own money. Maya paled. They're cutting off your resources. Shaq clenched his jaw. Calloway wasn't just covering his tracks. He was going on offense. No money, no evidence, no way to fight back. Or at least that's what Calloway thought. Maya's mind raced. There has to be something left, she muttered, pulling out her external hard drive. I backed up some files. Maybe. She plugged it in. The drive whirred. Then error, drive corrupted. Maya's hands went limp. No. Shaq took a slow breath. He could feel the walls closing in, the way Calloway was tightening the noose. But Shaq had played under pressure his entire life. He wasn't about to fold now. Maya looked up at him, panic flickering in her eyes. They've wiped everything, she said. The documents, the transactions, the backups. It's like it never existed. Shaq's fists clenched. It existed, Maya exhaled. Not anymore, and if we don't act fast, neither will we. Shaq looked at her. We're running out of time. Shaq pushed open the doors to his gym, expecting the usual. The rhythmic sound of weights clanking, the steady bounce of basketballs on the court, the familiar smell of sweat and determination. Instead, the room was silent. 2 uniformed police officers stood near the front desk, their eyes locked on him the second he walked in. Shaq's muscles tensed. Something was wrong. One officer, a broad-shouldered man with a stiff posture, stepped forward. His badge caught the overhead lights. Mr. Johnson, he said, voice clipped. We need to talk. Shaq glanced between them. About what? The second officer, a woman with narrowed eyes, pulled out a folded document. She handed it to Shaq without a word. Shaq unfolded the paper and scanned the bolded text. Charges. Tampering with federal records. His jaw tightened. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. The first officer didn't flinch. We have evidence linking you to unauthorized access of government documents related to a federal investigation. Shaq scoffed, shaking his head. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. The female officer didn't look amused. The evidence says otherwise. Shaq exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what this was. Calloway was making his move. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Maya's name flashing across the screen. He answered immediately. Shaq, she blurted out before he could say anything. We have a problem. Yeah, Shaq muttered, glancing at the 2 cops. I think I figured that out. Maya's voice was laced with panic. They're saying you hacked into a federal database. That's impossible. Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. You and I both know that. But Calloway doesn't care about the truth. This is bad, Maya breathed. They're not just trying to scare us anymore. They're coming for you. Shaq exhaled. Let them try. Shaq turned back to the officers, slipping his phone into his pocket. So let me get this straight, he said, crossing his arms. You're accusing me of hacking into government files? That's correct, the male officer replied. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And what exactly did I hack? The officer's expression didn't change. That's classified. Shaq laughed. Right, so let me get this straight. I'm being accused of a crime, but you can't even tell me what it is. Neither officer responded. Shaq took a step closer. Let me save you some time. I don't need to hack anything. I don't even know how to hack. I can barely set up my own Wi-Fi. The female officer's lips twitched, but she didn't bite. Shaq's voice dropped. You both know this is a setup. The male officer shifted slightly, just enough for Shaq to see the hesitation in his eyes. Shaq took another step forward, his voice firm. If Calloway thinks this little stunt is going to shake me, he's dumber than I thought. The gym had grown eerily quiet. Employees and members were watching, listening. Shaq turned his head slightly and saw his trainer, Malik, standing near the weight rack, fists clenched. Other gym-goers were frozen mid-workout, staring in disbelief. And that's when it hit Shaq. This wasn't just about trying to arrest him. Calloway wanted to humiliate him. He wanted to turn Shaq into a public scandal. Shaq smirked. You're gonna need better lies than that. Shaq barely had time to process what had happened at the gym before his phone buzzed again. Another call. Another problem. He exhaled sharply and walked toward his front door, rubbing the tension from his neck. Then he opened it, and chaos exploded. A woman stood on his porch, crying. Behind her, cameras flashed, voices shouted, microphones lunged forward. Shaq, do you have a comment? How long has this been going on? Is it true you're involved in illegal dealings? Shaq's gut tightened. This wasn't real. This was a setup. The woman on his porch was young, shaking, her mascara streaking down her face. She looked the part of a victim, small, vulnerable, terrified. But Shaq had been around too long to fall for an act. She wasn't making eye contact. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the cameras. Shaq's jaw clenched. Calloway sent her. Mr. Johnson, a reporter pushed forward, eyes gleaming with excitement. This woman claims you were involved in an underground financial operation. That you... Shaq raised a hand, shutting it down. Let me stop you right there, he said, voice calm but firm. I don't know this woman, and whatever story she's selling, it's a lie. The cameras flashed harder. But Mr. Johnson, Shaq turned to the woman, keeping his voice level. Who sent you? She swallowed. Didn't answer. The reporters pounced. Are you denying the allegations? Shaq let out a slow breath. This was Calloway's new move. He couldn't take Shaq down with fake financial crimes, so now he was playing dirty. Maya's car screeched into the driveway as Shaq shut the door in the reporters' faces. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her. What the hell was that? Shaq ran a hand over his face. Calloway's pulling the classic move. When you can't destroy the evidence, you destroy the messenger. Maya's eyes flickered with panic. Shaq, this is bad. He's not just trying to ruin your credibility. He's turning you into the scandal. Shaq nodded, his fists tightening. He had been fighting to expose corruption. Now, he was the one being accused. Maya pulled out her phone, scrolling frantically. It's everywhere. News blogs, Twitter, major outlets. Shaq cut her off. Then we need to flip this. Now. Shaq sat in Maya's dimly lit apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. His pulse was steady, but he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a rivalry on the court where the stakes were a championship ring. This was real. This was about taking down one of the most powerful men in the country. Maya sat beside him, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Once we upload this, there's no going back, she said, her voice tight. Shaq didn't hesitate. Good. With a single click, the file began to upload. A loading bar appeared, the numbers climbing slowly. 5%, 12%, 21%. This was it. Calloway's worst nightmare was about to go public. It took less than 10 minutes for the first shockwaves to hit. Maya's phone buzzed violently on the table, notifications flooding in like a dam had burst. Shaq watched as the Twitter trends refreshed in real time. Calloway scandal shot straight to the top. News outlets weren't far behind. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all ran breaking news alerts. The headlines were brutal. Leaked audio exposes corruption in Calloway charity. Millions in donations. Where did the money go? Senator Calloway accused of laundering millions through fake charities. Maya exhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. It's working, she murmured. Shaq wasn't convinced just yet. It's moving too fast. Maya glanced at him. What do you mean? Shaq's eyes stayed locked on the screen. He had seen plenty of PR nightmares in his career. But this was a full-scale implosion, and something about it felt off. As expected, Calloway made his move. Shaq and Maya turned their attention to the TV, where a special broadcast had interrupted regular programming. There he was, Senator Richard Calloway, live on national television, sitting in a pristine studio with a measured frown on his face. The anchor wasted no time. Senator Calloway, can you confirm or deny these allegations? Calloway exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. This is nothing more than a politically motivated attack. It's fake news, a desperate smear campaign designed to undermine the work I've done for this country. Shaq scoffed. Right on cue. Maya folded her arms. He's acting like the victim. Classic damage control. Calloway continued, his voice smooth and controlled. These so-called leaks? They come from anonymous sources. The audio, doctored, manipulated. The entire thing is a coordinated attack on my character. I will not be intimidated by false accusations. Shaq shook his head, a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. Calloway was scrambling. But then, Maya's phone buzzed again. She reached for it, but the moment she saw the screen, her face drained of color. Shaq's smirk disappeared instantly. What? Maya swallowed hard and turned the phone toward him. A new email. Anonymous sender. More leaked documents. Even worse than what they had. Shaq scanned the email quickly, his eyes narrowing as he read through the attachments. These weren't just financial records. They were internal memos, private communications, direct evidence that tied Calloway's dirty money to powerful figures in Washington. Maya's voice wavered. Shaq, this wasn't us. Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Someone else had just fueled the fire. Someone with access to information even deeper than theirs. But why? Maya's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the files. Who the hell sent this? Shaq didn't answer immediately. Because the real question wasn't who. It was what game were they playing. The smug confidence that once defined Senator Richard Calloway was gone. For the past decade, he had operated like an untouchable king, immune to scandals, protected by powerful allies, and always 3 steps ahead of anyone who dared challenge him. But now, he was running. The leaks had destroyed him. His name was plastered across every major news outlet. His closest allies, the donors, CEOs, and political figures who once smiled beside him at galas, were now cutting ties and issuing statements, denying any involvement with him. The political machine that once shielded him had turned its back. And the final blow? His secret offshore accounts, the millions he had stolen and hidden away, were suddenly inaccessible. Calloway panicked. Inside a dimly lit office, Calloway paced back and forth, his phone clutched tightly in his shaking hand. His lawyer sat across from him, sweating through his expensive suit. This is bad, the lawyer stammered. The feds are building a case. It's not just campaign fraud anymore. They're hitting you with money laundering and conspiracy charges. Calloway's hand clenched into a fist. Tell me something I don't know. The lawyer swallowed hard. Your accounts, and they're frozen, every single one. Calloway stopped pacing. His eyes darkened. That's impossible, he muttered. Sir, whoever leaked those documents, they didn't just expose you. They gave the feds everything. The offshore accounts, the transactions, the shell companies, all of it. For the first time in years, Calloway felt fear. He wasn't just being exposed. He was being dismantled. And that meant there was only one option left. Escape. Across town, Shaq sat in Maya's apartment, scrolling through the latest reports. Calloway's face was everywhere, flashing across the news, plastered on articles, trending on social media. The senator was issuing one weak denial after another, but no one was buying it. Maya was on the phone, whispering urgently. She had contacts, people inside the system who didn't mind leaking a little information when necessary. Then she hung up and turned to Shaq, her face tense. Calloway's making a run for it, she said. Shaq narrowed his eyes. Where? Maya hesitated. Private airstrip, outside the city. He's leaving the country. Shaq leaned forward. You're sure? Maya nodded. My contact says he's already booked a jet. He's trying to get out before they serve the warrant. Shaq exhaled sharply. Of course, Calloway was trying to escape. Cowards don't face consequences. They run, but not this time. Shaq wasn't going to let him get away. Maya grabbed her laptop, typing furiously. We need to get the FBI involved, she muttered. If we get them the right intel, they can block the airstrip. Shaq folded his arms. You think they'll move fast enough? Maya bit her lip. They won't have a choice. We have enough dirt to force their hand. She pulled up a secure line and started typing. Shaq watched as she sent a direct message to one of her government sources. Encrypted. Untraceable. Within moments, she got a reply. We're on it. Shaq exhaled. Now we wait. As the minutes dragged on, Shaq refreshed his screen, checking for updates. Then, a new live feed popped up. Security footage. His stomach clenched as he watched a black SUV racing toward the private airstrip. Maya turned to him, eyes wide. That's him. He's already on his way. The private airstrip was nearly deserted, the tarmac slick from a recent rain. The only sounds were the low hum of a waiting Gulfstream jet and the hurried footsteps of Senator Richard Calloway, as he stormed toward the stairs, his long coat billowing behind him. His heart pounded in his chest. He was so close. A few more steps and he'd be out of the country. No hearings, no trials, no consequences. He could regroup, rebuild his empire from somewhere safe. Then, a sharp screech of tires. Calloway froze. 5 black SUVs barreled onto the tarmac, engines roaring. Doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed out, weapons drawn. A voice rang through a megaphone. "Richard Calloway, step away from the plane." The senator's mouth went dry. Calloway quickly smoothed his coat, straightened his tie, and turned around with his most practiced, politician-friendly smile. "Officers," he said smoothly, his voice calm despite the panic clawing at his insides. "I'm not sure what all this is about, but I can assure you—" "Hands where we can see them," one of the agents barked, cutting him off. Calloway hesitated, his mind racing. He could still spin this. He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "This is a mistake. Do you know who I am?" One of the lead agents, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. "Yes, Senator, and that's why you're under arrest." Then, in front of the flashing lights, he flipped open the folder. Calloway's stomach dropped. Inside were dozens of pages, bank records, transaction logs, offshore accounts, wire transfers to shell companies. The documents laid out his entire empire of corruption. Every crime, every lie, publicly exposed. Calloway swallowed hard. His voice faltered. This isn't real." The agent ignored him and pulled out a second file. "This is a sworn statement from one of your former associates, detailing exactly how you laundered millions." Calloway's hands twitched. I need to speak to my lawyer." "You can do that at the station," the agent said flatly. Then, he pulled out the final piece of evidence, a USB drive. "We also have the leaked recordings, the ones where your men discuss silencing whistleblowers." Calloway's legs nearly buckled. There was no escape. Across town, Shaq and Maya sat in front of the TV, watching the breaking news unfold in real time. The news anchors could barely keep up with the flood of information. Senator Richard Calloway is now in FBI custody following a massive corruption scandal that has rocked Washington. Maya leaned forward, shaking her head in disbelief. "They actually got him." Shaq nodded, watching Calloway's every move on the screen. The once powerful politician now looked small, defeated. As the FBI agent pulled out handcuffs, Calloway didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just stood there, staring at the ground. The agent's voice was clear. "Richard Calloway, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The camera zoomed in as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. Then Calloway finally looked up, not with anger, not with defiance, with fear. Shaq frowned. Why does he look terrified? Shaq sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the TV screen. The footage looped over and over. Senator Richard Calloway in handcuffs, escorted by FBI agents into a black SUV. The once powerful politician kept his head down, avoiding the barrage of reporters shouting his name. His face, once full of arrogance, was now pale and hollow. A man who thought he was untouchable had just been touched. Shaq reached for the remote and turned the TV off, exhaling slowly. The silence in the room was thick. "Something's off," he muttered. Maya, seated across from him at her desk, looked up from her laptop. "What do you mean?" Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified. That wasn't the look of a man going to jail. That was the look of a man who knows something worse is coming. Maya frowned, replaying the moment in her head. "You think he knows something we don't?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, and I don't like it." The FBI wasted no time confirming the charges. Less than an hour after the arrest, a press conference was held. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The charges stacked like bricks, each one heavier than the last. "We have overwhelming evidence," the FBI spokesperson announced, his voice calm but firm. "Senator Calloway is engaged in extensive financial crimes, diverting millions of dollars meant for charities into offshore accounts and illegal campaign funds. This is just the beginning of a long legal process, but rest assured, justice will be served." Shaq watched the clips online, scrolling through reactions on social media. Some people celebrated. Others, mostly Calloway's loyalists, screamed about fake news and political witch hunts. None of it mattered. Calloway was done. So why didn't it feel like a victory? Shaq rubbed his chin, deep in thought. "Maya, pull up Calloway's campaign donors." She shot him a questioning look, but didn't argue. Within seconds, she was scrolling through files. "What are we looking for?" Shaq stared at the names flashing across the screen. Connections, patterns, people who might have been pulling the strings behind him. Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard. Most of these donors are the usual: corporate sponsors, political backers, real estate developers. Her voice trailed off. Shaq caught the shift in her tone. What? Maya's eyes narrowed. This one doesn't fit. She clicked on a name, opening a separate file. Shaq leaned closer. Who the hell is that? The name on the screen meant nothing to him, but the amount of money they had pumped into Calloway's campaigns, it was more than suspicious. Maya's brows furrowed. I don't know, but I'm about to find out. Before Maya could dig deeper, her laptop dinged. A new email had appeared. Encrypted. No sender. No subject line. Maya hesitated, then clicked. Shaq watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. What is it? He asked. Maya didn't answer immediately. She was scanning the email, her eyes widening with every line. Then finally she turned the screen toward him. Shaq's stomach tightened. The email contained dozens of files, documents, internal memos, names, bank transactions, not just about Calloway, about others, bigger players. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq, this goes way deeper than we thought. Shaq scrolled through the files, his jaw tightening. The corruption didn't start or end with Calloway. He wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn. The real power was higher up. Names of top business executives, government officials, even law enforcement officers littered the documents. Jesus, Shaq muttered. Maya swallowed. Someone wanted us to see this. But why? Shaq exhaled. Either they want us to take these people down or they're warning us to back off. Maya glanced at him, concern in her eyes. And what do we do? Shaq smirked, closing the laptop. One down. Plenty more to go.